So this is about the truth and consequences of marijuana as medicine. I always start with my disclosures. I have no conflict of interest with this content whatsoever, but I am a consultant with Braeburn Pharmaceuticals. They are developing a medication to treat opioid dependence. None of my work there has anything to do with my presentation, but I want you to know it because I'm often accused as being, with my work and advocacy against marijuana, as benefiting from it. And I don't want anybody to be able to impeach me because I didn't disclose something to you. I'm also director at Two Dreams. It's a treatment facility. So we do treatment, and I'm not talking about treatment today, and I'm not selling treatment, but you need to know it just for full disclosure. Now, the ASAM paper was written because there's been this increased popular interest in the therapeutic properties of marijuana. But we've done the scientific work not on marijuana, the crude herbal plant, but in the cannabinoid system. So I'm going to talk about the cannabinoid system and the molecule today. Empirical research has slowly accumulated and has recently gained attention in the medical community. But a problem developed with ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is a group of 3,500 physicians who are uniquely positioned to have opinions on this area because some states began to legalize and allow marijuana dispensaries. And there's been little evidence to guide a process in a rational, ethical manner that would guarantee patient safety. So I'm going to talk about all of that today. Now, when Bob DuPont and I chaired the committee that wrote the white paper that I've given you today, ASAM had something in mind, and what they wanted us to do was to examine the circumstances that was leading to this call for legalization and distribution of marijuana. What led to this crisis that we're having in this country that is trying to foist an untested, crude botanical on people as medicine? We were asked to explore the scientific issues involved in moving toward a resolution so that we wanted to use our unique expertise to help strategize how we could get out of this situation. And we were also asked to set out recommendations that would assist physicians in coping with the issue. We recognized at the time we wrote the paper that there were several states that had medical marijuana bills and that physicians were in an untenable position in those states, having to address patients who were coming to them, asking for them to give them a diagnosis that would qualify them for using marijuana in this way. And they also asked us to propose some policy recommendations for consideration that were intended to reduce the potential for more problems in the future. So we looked at what had happened, what was going on, and what might happen if we as physicians didn't change what we were doing and develop the white paper. And the reason I'm focusing a lot on the white paper and its content with you folks today is that I know that many of you have heard a lot of the myths about marijuana. You've seen this happening. Some people, my colleagues in the treatment field, have questions about whether they should have anything to do with this at all. And you're often asked in back channels to advise representative legislators about what position they should take. And I want you fully equipped. We decided that we needed to make a fully disclosed a statement on this process available and accessible to people so that individuals and communities would be inoculated against more of this. So I'm going to start with the take-home message and then tell you how we got there. So our recommendations were that cannabis and cannabis-based medications and the delivery systems used to deliver those medications should be subject to the same standards that are applicable to other prescription medications. That these medications and devices should not be distributed unless and until such time that they receive marketing approval from the Food and Drug Administration. So that you understand what that means, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. That physicians should reject responsibility for providing access to cannabis unless and until such time that they receive approval from the FDA. And I'm going to talk about why that's important when we look at the way these bills are structured. We also noted that we reject smoking as a means of drug delivery systems, since smoking is inherently unsafe. And I'm going to talk about why vaporizers don't solve that problem in a minute. We also said that we support the need for federal regulatory standards, that the states, in a quilt-like fashion or a patchwork-like system, could not efficiently regulate to protect the public health sufficiently in this area, so that we need federal regulatory standards to be upheld. We recognize that states can sometimes enact limitations that are more restrictive than the federal government, but in this area, we reject the concept that states could enact a more permissive regulatory standard. And not only is it because of the public health, the issues of the public health, which I'll delve into a little bit more later, but it's also because the United States is subject to international conventions around drug control that are not eliminated. Our obligation to the international community through these conventions is not extinguished because California or Illinois or Missouri decides to handle this crude botanical in a way that's different than federal regulations. We also discourage the state interference in the federal medication approval process, primarily because we reject a process whereby state and local ballot initiatives approve medicines, because these initiatives are being decided by individuals who are not qualified to make such decisions. When you think about it, Joe Citizen, Jane Public, is not qualified to make a decision about what constitutes a medicine, or to review a scientific body of data that is normally reviewed that allows a medicine to go into the formularies of hospitals and doctors across the country. We also asserted that physicians who choose to discuss medical use of cannabis and cannabis-based products, that we couldn't, muzzle physicians, that physicians might want to discuss that, and physicians ought to be able to discuss all kinds of things with their patients. But if they do choose to discuss cannabis and cannabis-based products, that they need to adhere to established professional tenets of patient care, which means that that patient would have a history and a good faith examination given, that a treatment plan with objectives would be developed, that informed consent would be provided, including a discussion of the risks, side effects, and potential benefits of making this decision of operating outside of the standard of medical care, that periodic review of that treatment's efficacy needed to occur, that consultation needed to occur as necessary, and that proper record keeping that supports the decision to use cannabis would be available for peer review. Now that means that a bus couldn't drive up in front of a bar at closing, load a bunch of people on it, and take them to a doctor's office where that doctor would write prescriptions for cannabis on cocktail napkins. That would not meet the standard of care. We also asserted that physicians who choose to discuss the medical use of cannabis and cannabis-based products have a bona fide physician-patient relationship with the patient, that relationship exists in the way that relationship exists with every other patient, that the recommendations in a particular physician's office is not disproportionately large or even exclusive to their practice. Now, we recognize that patients who treat cancer may prescribe more opioids than physicians who treat cancer may prescribe more opioids than a physician that treats eczema. And that a physician who might be having these discussions might do more of it than a colleague who didn't. But we didn't want to see physician practices developing around making these recommendations, benefiting from making the recommendation in a cash transfer kind of transaction. We also assert that physicians not issue a recommendation unless that physician has adequate information regarding the composition and dose of the cannabis product being recommended, and that physician have adequate training in identifying substance abuse and addiction, since one of the major concerns of chronic exposure to THC in the cannabis plant would be the development of substance abuse or dependence. Now, just a minute to understand the plant. This is a day plant. It grows when there are long hours of daylight. It produces a mix of leaves, flowers, stems, and seeds. It is a rich source of a variety of compounds, cannabinoids, multiple cannabinoids, although the cannabis plants in this country have been bred to overproduce THC, which is the active ingredient that people are seeking for its psychoactive effect. Terpenoids and flavonoids, which gives it its smell and taste. And the exact content or chemical composition varies by plant. There are 60 different cannabinoids which can be expressed in these plants. But U.S. cannabis is bred to exhibit high levels of THC, and when inhaled, when burned, the THC is released into the smoke, and it has an effect on the central nervous system and produces the typical high. I'm going to describe that in a little bit. THC acts on the cannabinoid receptors in the brain and the peripheral nervous system. They are part of the endocannabinoid system, and the endocannabinoid system functions to regulate relaxation, appetite, sleeping, forgetting, and protection. The body has naturally occurring endocannabinoids. Anandamide is the one that's most prominent. But THC taken from outside the body overactivates the endocannabinoid system, causing the high and other effects. Now, cannabis rose to prominence in the early 19th century, and there were preparations available through the backs of traveling medicinal salesmen, trucks, where it was primarily an elixir with alcohol. These preparations lacked standardization, and the active ingredients were unknown. There are lots of things available out of the backs of those traveling salesmen's trucks. But what became clear over time was that the patient response to these elixirs was unreliable. And while it's always assumed that the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 restricted the prescription of cannabis preparations, it really was that better medicines were developed, and the unreliable response that patients had drove it out of favor. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 did, in fact, bring about a change in availability, but the change was coming because it was an unreliable product that could not produce reproducible effects. There was variable potency, erratic and unpredictable individual responses, and with the introduction of synthetic and more stable pharmaceutical substitutes, the need for these kinds of elixirs went away. In 1964, THC was discovered to be the main psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, and interest in smoking of marijuana for its psychoactive effects began to arise. Also, interest in finding therapeutic uses began to rise, but there was a technological lag that prevented us from finding the therapeutic uses of the molecules in the cannabis plant. At the turn of the century, when cocaine and opium and cannabis were being used in these unregulated elixirs, cocaine and opium went a direction away from cannabis because those molecules were water-soluble and easily handled, could be isolated and dissolved in water or alcohol. On the other hand, the molecule in the cannabis plant is sticky, can't be dissolved in water. We couldn't develop preparations for the delivery of it in the same way that we did other water-soluble molecules, and it is extremely unstable when separated from the plant at room temperature. It degrades on the shelf. So the technological lag in being able to handle that sticky, sensitive, unreliable, unsteady molecule kept us from being able to develop products at the same time that we were developing cocaine and opium and other kinds of things that were water soluble. And the development of medicinal products from cocaine, opium, and other things quickly separated medicinal use from so-called recreational use of those two, but marijuana didn't go that way and stayed in a holding pattern of so-called recreational use, and medicinal use for it didn't develop. And so it lagged. And it took a while for us to figure out how to handle that particular molecule. But with the dawn of cannabinoid neuroscience, the discovery of endocannabinoid receptors, and the fact that we actually have molecules in our brain that stimulate those receptors in the 1980s and early 1990s, ushered in a new era, an area for medication development. And we know from studying that area that this endocannabinoid system acts in just about every physiological system. Now, when you have something that is that ubiquitous in the body, where stimulating it can affect a whole host of other things and create a number of cascades, it's a very dangerous area to mess around in pharmacologically, because you may have a target but may create another effect downstream or somewhere else that was unintended or unexpected. But despite those challenges, the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute on Drug Abuse got together and decided to create a mechanism to address a serendipitous finding that when people smoked marijuana, they got hungry. And from that collaborative effort on the part of our National Institute of Health, the medication dronabinol or Marinol was born. So from seeing the serendipitous finding, we actually went about trying to isolate that molecule. I'm going to talk more about that medicine in a minute and the fact that it is available, and give you information around why some advocates say, even though marijuana is available in a pill form, it's inadequate for most of their purposes. And I'll talk a little bit about that, because you'll sometimes have that thrust back at you when you're trying to say, well, let's just use Marinol. I'll give you some ammunition in dealing with that. Now, these cannabinoid receptors are found in higher concentrations than any other receptor in the brain, and they are in a number of very critical brain areas that are associated with executive functioning, like making good decisions, the cortex, and the seats of abuse and dependence, the nucleus accumbens. Also in the cerebellum, which is responsible for our ability to be coordinated. And the CB2 receptors are mostly peripheral. Activity in the endocannabinoid system is constantly modulating a huge variety of brain and physiological functions. Again, they're distributed widely, and they're acting in a number of systems. So when you're going in and, in the sort of crude way of mucking around in that system, you can have a lot of intended and unintended consequences from adding something external to the body. These physiological functions include short-term memory, learning, appetite, anxiety and fear, pain, and spontaneous motor activity. Now, there are some aspects of the endocannabinoid system that are important from the perspective of addiction medicine physicians. Heavy concentration of these receptors in the brain create a response in downregulation of them from exogenous cannabinoids, meaning that when you're exposed to THC that you bring from the outside, it turns down your ability to respond to the anandamide that's in your brain. And this downregulation is immediate and profound. THC and similar molecules are able to affect the brain because they mimic the naturally occurring neural transmitters and flood these receptor sites with stimulation. Now, the question arises, is there some medicinal value in stimulating or reducing the activity within the endocannabinoid system? And that value would come from understanding three things: the specific areas of the brain where this chemistry is concentrated and the functions served by those areas, the specific disease or symptom that you're trying to treat with an endocannabinoid, and then any side effects that are produced by the treatment. So you have to do a medical cost-benefit analysis to determine whether there's value, medicinal value. And while I'm focusing a lot on the CB1, which is in the brain, whether there's an interaction with the CB2 peripherally, and the effects of that also have to be considered. So after looking at the history of marijuana in this country and the claims of medical effect of marijuana, we got together to determine what is ASAM's perspective on medicalizing the cannabinoid therapy. And what we determined was that we recognize that there is a role within the body's natural endocannabinoid system in the brain, and that it has a role in the brain in many physiological functions. As a result of its representation everywhere, it suggests that there are probably going to be multiple illnesses that are likely to benefit from medications that are based on the body's inherent endocannabinoid system. Since they're everywhere, they can produce a wide variety of symptoms. And if we're trying to reduce symptomatology, there probably are a number of targets where these molecules might act. And ASAM recognizes that these new medications that are acting on this wide variety of receptors that are widely represented in the brain will either stimulate or block endocannabinoid system activity. And as a result of that knowledge and those predictions, we do know that there are lots of new medications in development. But all of the evidence to date, and I'm going to review the studies for you in a moment, all of the evidence to date supports that we should do trials on components of the marijuana plant, not treatment. And I have AGB after that statement because that is a direct quote of me. It doesn't come out of the ASAM paper, but it is based upon intensive study in this area for me and an understanding of the medication development process. So all of the evidence that we have, and I'm going to review all the studies for you so that you'll know what's out there, all of the evidence to date suggests that we should be doing some study on how to use the endocannabinoid system to reduce symptoms and signs of disease, and maybe even affect disease. But the evidence only supports trials and not treatment, meaning we need to do more in order to know precisely what can be done. That is an important take-home message. If you're writing anything down, underline that. The evidence only supports trials, not treatment. Now, what's the significance of medical marijuana in the United States? Well, there are lots of states in which there exists a defense for the possession of marijuana. I have them listed for you. You'll hear a lot being said that, you know, a host or the majority of states have moved in this direction. The last time I counted, there were 50 states in the District of Columbia. That would mean 26 would make half. We're nowhere near that. So that's one of the myths that's often told, that most of the states have gone in this direction, so we may as well follow their lead. I think the states that have gone in this direction have suffered greatly from that move, and we ought to learn from their mistakes and their circumstances. But also, when you hear things about the medical marijuana is legal in these states, medical marijuana is not legal. None of the laws, initiatives, statutes allow marijuana to be legal in those states. They don't create new rights, but they provide an affirmative defense in most instances if you're caught with marijuana. So it allows you to have a defense for consideration. None of the recent passages of laws for so-called legalized marijuana prohibit employers from having workplace drug testing. They try to move in that direction, but there have been some case law that's tested it, and in all instances, the rights of the employer have been upheld. So these medical marijuana states don't provide new rights. They provide mostly affirmative defenses. They've created a proliferation of dispensaries, and they are exposing thousands of naive users to these products despite a lack of thorough research on what these products are doing. The next several slides review for you, I'm not going to read them to you, what national expert bodies have said. And I have included the detail for you because you will often hear that the Institute of Medicine supports medical marijuana. The Institute of Medicine supports that smoked cannabis must meet the same standards of effectiveness and safety as other medications. And most of these national bodies that have been reported widely as a part of the myth-making around medical marijuana, have supported research, have supported getting answers, but they haven't supported passing a law or a bill or initiative in any local, county, or state jurisdiction that would allow the use of marijuana as medicine. So they're all here for you. The Institute of Medicine does report that marijuana should be available for short-term use, less than 6 months, in certain clinical trials, only in individuals with diseases that are assumed to have a reasonable expectation of response. When this was written versus what's available now in the literature, that's no one, based upon the current research. They also suggested that it would be appropriate to use in short-term use with someone who has an intractable life-threatening or life-ending disease. When there was a failure of all other approved medications documented, when there was a reasonable expectation of response, under direct supervision of a physician with a review of the effectiveness being noted, and with IRB approval and oversight. So that's a very high standard, which is never met in any instance when a state ballot initiative allows access to marijuana as medicine. The American Medical Association upheld more strongly than anything else the physician's right to have a free discussion on treatment between the physician and the patient, and talked about looking at whether marijuana should be scheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. I'll talk a little bit more about why that makes no difference. It would only be an empty win for marijuana advocates. It makes no difference to whether we get answers to this problem or not. The American College of Physicians talked about strongly supporting from federal criminal prosecution, criminal liability or professional liability, all physicians who prescribe marijuana in accordance with state laws. None of the state laws require prescription of marijuana. They require the certification of a disease that will allow one access to a card that would allow them access to marijuana. So there is a misunderstanding of the term prescription. And despite the American College of Physicians calling for this, most malpractice insurance providers will not cover a physician who has made a recommendation for marijuana if there was an untoward event in the life of that person who's prescribed marijuana. So there is no professional liability coverage available through any legitimate medical malpractice benefit available currently. The nurses have gone a little further than most of the other professional bodies, but their call for confirmation of the therapeutic efficacy of marijuana, which is a misstatement because, as you're going to see a little later, you can't show the therapeutic efficacy of something that you can't quantify. I want to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the federal position is very clear. Substances are classified under 5 schedules, and marijuana is classified as a Schedule 1, which means it has a high potential for abuse. There is no currently accepted medical use in treatment, and there is a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision data. Now, I want to pause a little bit on this slide because often the marijuana advocates will portray marijuana as an extremely benign substance that's being used, you know, it's a God-given herb that you can pick out of your garden, and if we don't allow access to it, we're supporting, you know, these single molecule chemicals that the pharmaceutical industry makes a lot of money off of. But it really is a safe and natural compound which could be used in the same way we use other folk remedies, such as a hot toddy or a honey lemon tea when we have a sore throat. But the difference between a folk remedy and a modern medicine is vast. And modern medicines can be over-the-counter medicines, they can be medicines available by prescriptions, they can be medicines that are available only through specialty pharmacies, it can be a whole host of things. A folk remedy uses plant products according to folklore, versus a highly purified or a defined molecule which makes up a medicine for a very specific illness for which a specific claim has been studied and validated by external impartial review of the FDA. The folk remedy is used for a poorly defined illness or symptom with little understanding of the pathophysiology. You don't have to understand why your throat hurts to have a little bit of relief from honey and lemon heated. But a modern medicine, you have to understand the nature of the illness. There's little understanding of the role of medicine in therapy for folk medicines, but in modern medicine, there is a recognized effect on a pathological process that's been described, and the mechanism of action of the medicine is often understood, or at least elucidated. Folk remedies are inconsistent. It's hard to quantify the amounts that you take in order to resolve the symptom. The modern medicine is given in a controlled dose with a predictable delivery system. Marijuana, if it were a folk remedy, would only be applied to signs and symptoms of insignificant diseases. Yet every time a ballot initiative is written, it is written for the most extreme form of the disease in individuals who have severely debilitating disease. So it has to be either fish or fowl. It can't be neither.